wonderful and sad to see so many people on this evening. I was thinking, unfortunately, it seems in the last, well, I'd say 6+ years, that every time there is a rally about something that I deeply care about, it's on Shabbat. That seems to be the new normal, that it's always on Shabbat, which means that I can really never participate. So I hadn't really thought when I scheduled this for tonight. I scheduled it for tonight because every weekday was busy in the coming week with either my schedule or the synagogue schedule. And I thought this is a topic that people want to hear about. But I thought, when I realized as it was getting closer to 7:30, I thought, well, this is our way of gathering. For those of us that couldn't be part of a rally yesterday, this is our chance of gathering. I've actually spoken about the topic on Jewish views on abortion. I have to say, naively, I don't know why I assumed that everyone in the Jewish community knew that Jewish views on abortion and Jewish law on abortion was significantly different than Catholic views or evangelical views on abortion. I just sort of assumed that everybody knew that and really didn't talk about it. And then after it became very clear, after Trump was elected, that he would be choosing most likely our Supreme Court justices, when the Torah portion that most significantly addresses abortion, I spoke about the Parsha and I happened to be about mitzvah, so, I didn't ask the family first. And I was so surprised at the reaction of both congregants and Jewish visitors and guests of the bat mitzvah, that they were so surprised at Jewish views on abortion, that I have spoken about it again on Shabbat morning. But I realized that I never offered these same sources to teach these sources when it wasn't Shabbat morning, and when I perhaps would have the ability, for some of you that hadn't heard it, to have the chance to hear it, and some of you that have heard it to sort of have a refresher. And unfortunately, I'm starting to feel, I'm starting to feel a lot like we're having a conversation about closing the barn door after the horse is already out. I am feeling like probably many of you, besides being, very angry at the politics, but incredibly frustrated that the possibility of overturning Roe v. Wade has been a slow train coming since 1973. And I'm feeling my most politically frustrated right now with Democrats, who have seen this coming almost my entire lifetime, and here we are, and wondering why we didn't come up with a political solution before it was too late. In any case, because we never give up hope, tonight we will look at really how our tradition has dealt with abortion. I really only brought a few sources because there are more that could be brought, but I brought a few sources. We're going to look at the Torah, which of course is the basis for how we at least begin to discuss or understand how the Torah viewed abortion, or they didn't call it abortion. So there's nowhere in the Torah that says, let's talk about abortion. So what happens in Jewish law is you take sources that address the issue in a certain way, and then that's how you begin to look at it. And then I brought some rabbinic sources and some sources from the 18th and 19th century. And then we'll end by looking at, what the conservative movement, what our movement says about abortion. So the first thing that I will share my screen so you can see this. We're going to look at a couple of verses from the book of Exodus in the Torah, from the book of Shemot, from the Torah portion of Mishpatim. So mishpatim means laws, and in this Torah portion, it discusses many, many different things. And so I'm going to read you the verses, and then we'll go back and unpack how the ancient rabbis and not so ancient rabbis applied this to the idea of abortion. So, he who fatally strikes a man shall be put to death. I hope this doesn't shock anybody that the Torah legislated capital punishment, that there were times when capital punishment was the punishment. And if you killed somebody, if you murdered somebody, right? If you murdered somebody, then you were put to death. And then it goes on, the very few verses later, when men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. I feel it's incumbent on me to say that, you know, the Jews have gotten a lot of criticism for the whole idea of eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But let's just suffice it to say that the rabbis always interpreted that as a monetary fine. Not literally, you poke somebody's eye out, you got your eye poked out, but that's a lesson for a different evening. So I'm going to stop sharing just for a minute so I can see everybody's screen. So these two verses are juxtaposed, right? What happens, and somebody can unmute and just jump in and answer. If you murder somebody, what is the punishment?
Said life for life.
Well, let's keep life for life out of it because that was, you know, yes, but yes, I worry about those verses because they're so loaded. But in any case, yes, you murder somebody, you are liable for the death penalty. Now, what's the scenario? Two men are fighting, and the pregnant woman somehow gets in the middle of it, gets involved, and she's knocked down and a miscarriage ensues. What's the punishment? I know I took the verses down, so that's kind of not fair. Marcia Edelman?
I think that it depends on what other injuries there are. If she is killed, it's I'm assuming, I don't know if a man killed a woman, if it was a death penalty.
Yes, he'd still be liable for the death penalty.
But it depends on her other injuries.
So
bruises, broken bones, whatever.
But it's a monetary fine.
And right? To be discussed, to be figured out.
It's a monetary fine. So you cause somebody to miscarry and the fetus dies, the Torah tells us this is a monetary fine. And what's important about this is juxtaposing it against a murder. In other words, in the Jewish tradition, abortion is not murder. That is so significantly important to the Jewish view on abortion. Now, when we look at other sources, we're going to see it doesn't mean that abortion is like, great, great, everybody should go, doesn't mean there aren't limits. It doesn't mean that abortion is considered, great. It's, a form of birth control. But to say that abortion is not murder sets us on a very different path than our Catholic and evangelical brethren. And I think I found out, I was quite surprised to learn, and maybe all of you knew this already, and this doesn't surprise you, but I was so surprised the first time I actually taught this, which was only like 6 years ago, that Jews were surprised. They assumed that if you were religious, right? If you were religious, you must have the same worldview or the same interpretation. We talk a lot about the Judeo-Christian tradition. So people assumed that if you were a religious Jew, you must assume that abortion would be forbidden because it's murder. And in our tradition, it is not forbidden, right? It's not forbidden. It's not considered murder. So let's talk about some other, we're going to look at some other sources, and then we'll look at some modern sources, and we can ask the question. So what does that mean about the permissibility of abortion? So another thing, right? And this is from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the earliest collection of rabbinic literature. So it's about 2,000 years old. If a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb and bring it forth limb by limb, because her life comes before the life of the child. But if the greater part has come out, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for another. So this source tells us two very important things, which is if a doctor has to make a choice between the life of the babe, the fetus, and the mother's life takes precedent. So if this pregnancy in any way, at any time, whether it's before labor or during the pregnancy itself, if in any way the mother's life is in danger, you abort the child. The fetus. I shouldn't say child. That is exactly the wrong. It sends exact wrong message. It's not what Jews would say. You abort the fetus in order to save the mother at any time during the pregnancy, even up till the very last minute. Once the baby is almost all the way out, then you can't kill the baby. Then you have to you try to save both of them, but you can't decide to not save. You have to try to save both of them, and you can't choose the mother after the baby. And that's because at that point, once most of the baby is out, it's considered a person. So this teaches us another very important principle, that until that baby is born in Jewish tradition, it's not a person. This becomes a very important something that differentiates us, right? I don't know if this is true of all Christians. I don't really only know about evangelical and Catholicism. When does life begin? If you were Catholic and don't make the joke about for Jews, life begins when your youngest goes to college. But for a Catholic, when does life begin? Rosette? Rosette, you can unmute and jump in.
Yeah, conception.
Conception, right? Life begins at conception. In the Jewish tradition, when does life begin? When the baby is
At birth,
right? When the baby is almost all the way out of, I guess, let's say its head's out, it's starting to breathe on its own. That's when life begins. And so you can see that is a very different way then of conceptualizing what is happening in a woman's body with this fetus. And what goes along with that is the idea that the baby does not actually have a soul until it's born. So a fetus does not have the status in Jewish tradition of a human life. This actually has nothing to do with abortion, but in Judaism, traditionally, you didn't mourn a baby that died until the baby was 30 days old. And the reason for that was because, and this has nothing to do with abortion. It was a life and it died, and you couldn't, there's nothing, but babies weren't very viable. Babies died very young. Women had lots of babies. You could be in mourning for all of your childbearing years if you had to go through the ritual of a full mourning for a baby. Now, the interesting thing today, at least in the United States, I've been involved in this, and I've had friends involved in this, in creating ritual, both for miscarriage, because there's no ritual if you have a miscarriage. There was no ritual in Jewish law to acknowledge a miscarriage. And so I getting involved in creating those things, because in this day and age, blessedly, thank God, losing a child in infancy, thank God, is very is rare in a country with modern medicine, but that wasn't true for most of history until very recently. Nonetheless, putting that aside, life begins at birth, and that again is a very different concept. So whatever you're doing when you abort a fetus, it is not considered a life. And then the other question is, politically or legally, there's a lot of questions about, viability. When does viability begin, and does that affect the law? And of course, with modern medicine, viability can begin, at a much earlier point in the pregnancy than it could before there was any type of therapeutic technologies. But Judaism would have said viability is at birth, whenever that occurs, and before that, it's not considered viability. So Judaism has never actually, and even modern scholars, Jewish scholars who address these issues, have very different views about viability. So let's just look at a couple more sources, and then we will open it up. Okay. So okay, so this is just Rashi commenting on the Mishnah and just agreeing that that the baby is not considered a human being until it's born. So again, this is another source, a rabbinic source that again talks about the idea that abortion or if you cause a miscarriage, it's not murder. If a person strikes any person, a nefesh, a soul, and he dies, he shall be put to death. I might think that an 8-month birth who is destined to die is also included. It is therefore written, if one strikes a man, whereby we are apprised that he is not liable unless he kills one who is destined to live. So until the baby is born, there is no assumption that the baby is destined to live until the baby is actually alive. Now, again, none of these sources talk about abortion, but they talk about causing a miscarriage. So this is sort of an interesting one. If a woman is about to be executed, they do not wait for her until she gives birth. But if she's already sat on the birth stool, they wait for her until she gives birth. So in other words, if a woman is pregnant and she's committed a crime and she's liable for capital punishment, you can kill her and it doesn't matter that she's pregnant. There's no sense of like, well, you can't take this life of this baby. The rabbis actually in other places talk about it's not considered a life, so you don't have to worry about it. So let's just stop there if people have questions, because this is, with Judaism, you have to, acknowledge that we are dealing with ancient texts. And so they don't always deal with the exact, subject at hand, but it's really how rabbis and how Jewish law apply the texts. So let's just stop there. Does anybody have any questions? Jim.
Yes, if Jews do not believe that baby's not real until they come out, does that mean that evangelicals will believe that at conception the fetus has a soul?
Yes, that is my understanding of evangelical theology and Catholic theology as well, and maybe other for Christianity, but you don't hear, the more mainline churches are not really the ones leading this fight in our country, and there are many liberal Christian views on abortion as well. So and it's a very diverse, traditions within Christianity, but evangelical and Catholicism believe that life begins at conception, that a baby, a fetus, an embryo is ensouled, and therefore, if you should at any point, right? I mean, we know that even though there's a debate about, law and viability and when do you limit it, I have a really hard time saying this because it's all making me really crazy, but like the Texas law and the Florida law are too liberal for Catholics and evangelicals. right? They consider those laws, it is murder. Like the morning after, it's murder because this embryo is ensouled. That would be their theology. Howard, we have to unmute.
It seems to me from the miscarriage case that even if it's not murder, it looks like it's a wrong. And the fetus is clearly treated as property of the husband
Yeah.
that needs to be compensated for. But I've never seen anything other than the case where they talk about having to choose between the life of the mother and the child. Anything that affirmatively says in Jewish tradition that abortion is an acceptable course of action
We'll get there.
other than there. Okay.
We'll get there. Because
I'll
later
push through.
sources, look, later sources begin to speak about it. Look, I don't know what let's be honest, I don't know enough about the time of the Bible, what was available to women to terminate pregnancies. Like, I don't know. I will tell you an interesting fun fact that we learned from Neil Edelman, our congregant Neil Edelman, who is an attorney who's done, I did a presentation one year on Yom Kippur about abortion in American law. And I was quite surprised to find out that abortion was legal in the United States till about 1900. Legal. Now, what kind of medicines, potions, what women did, I have no idea. What herbs or what I don't know what they did, but abortion was legal, which I have no idea because I'm not a lawyer. But when they talk about, what was, precedent and law that, especially when the Constitution was written, that abortion was actually not outlawed in this country, which is an interesting fun fact. And lawyers would have to tell me if that has any bearing. But yes, I mean, what Howard said is really, the fetus, if you caused a woman to miscarry, you caused damage to the husband because, yes, it was his, property and children were financial assets, especially if you in agriculture and the like. So, but we'll get to sources, right? It's still, we're still not there from how do you get to it's not murder to is it permitted? Barb or Sheila, I see your hand up. I don't know which one of you has a question. Sheila.
Okay. You said that Jewish law is different from Catholic and evangelical law about what constitutes as a life. Since Christianity basically came from Judaism, where did that disconnect form?
Thank you.
I really don't know, to tell you the truth. I don't know the answer to that question. But there's a lot of disconnects. Why don't they keep Shabbat on Saturday? How did it get to be Sunday? I mean, that we probably could have more information about. But I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Jonah.
This might be where Howard was going also, but so far we've talked about the Jewish view on what is a life, when does abortion become murder, that kind of thing. But we haven't talked about the liberal angle of privacy and a person's right to control their own medical decisions. I'd like to hear about that.
So I'm not sure that I can really address that from a Jewish point of view. But because I actually think that the better road to go with the Jewish community, and I'm not the only person talking about this is an issue of religious freedom. That if we have a different view, we have a different religious view of abortion, and we are not allowed to follow our own religious teachings, this is a violation of religious freedom in the United States. I don't know that if you want to hang it on the hook of Jewish law, there's not a lot of sources about that particular thing. So let's look, since people want to know, okay, that's very nice that the Torah talks about miscarriage, but thank you, Rabbi, but what you said we were going to talk about abortion. So I just wanted to show you that in order to talk about abortion, which we're going to talk about right now, you have to like have these two fun facts, which is it's not murder and it's not a human life until a baby is actually born. So that's sort of the basis that we hang everything else on. So the next source we're going to look at, and there are sources in between the Mishnah, which is 2,000 years ago, and Rabbi Jacob Emden, who, as you can see, was writing between 1739 and 1759. So now we will start to have sources. He was a very respected halakha is Jewish law. He was a very respected halachic scholar. People went to rabbis and asked them questions, and they would look at the sources, including the Torah, including the Mishnah, and they would look. Now we've got, this is how we jump from what the Torah and the Mishnah says to the application in Jewish law. So people would go to scholars in their, either in their town or somebody that was famous, and they would write a letter and they would ask a question, which is a tshuva, and he would, they were all he's then, would issue a response, which was called a, somebody would ask a she'elah, a question, and they would issue a tshuva and a response, and that would then become an acceptable way of applying the law. So they had to figure out, how do you take the sources that we already spoke about and apply it? So the person that asked him a question about an adulterous married woman, and she's pregnant, right? So this is a bad thing. An adulterous married woman who is having an affair and is pregnant. Can she have an abortion? It appears to me to permit her to abort. And even in the case of a legitimate fetus, there is reason to be lenient if there's great need, as long as the fetus has not begun to emerge, even if the mother's life is not in jeopardy, but only so as to save her from an evil associated with that would cause her great pain. So, right, to give birth to this child, you don't know who the father is, or maybe you know that the father's not your husband, and you're going to have to live with this horrible pain for the rest of your life, for his life, for what it could do for your marriage. She is permitted to have an abortion, even not at risk to her life. And he then goes on to apply that and says, any type of terrible emotional distress, a woman may have an abortion. And that is actually in Jewish law, codified into Jewish law. When can a woman have an abortion? She can have an abortion if it's a risk to her physical health, but she also may have an abortion if it is a risk to her mental health. How do you decide if it's a risk to her mental health? You'd think in a tradition that has very detailed laws about how we kosher meat would have a whole list of how the criteria, right? You'd have a list and you'd check it off, and no. The answer is in our tradition. How do you decide if it's a risk to her mental health? She decides. By the way, in another much more minor example, if fasting makes you ill on Yom Kippur, and ill doesn't mean, not life-threatening ill. You get a headache, you get woozy, you think you're going to faint. Who decides whether you are able to actually fast on Yom Kippur? You decide. It's up to you. If you think, if you're a healthy person that can do it, you're supposed to do it. But if you feel that it's too hard for you, and please, everybody fast on Yom Kippur, but if you feel like it's too hard for you, you decide. Not a court of law. Maybe this is the privacy part of it, Jonah, right? Not a court of law, not your doctor. Now, your doctor can tell you don't fast, right? And then you're supposed to listen. Like, your doctor may diagnose that it would be bad for you. But Judaism allows that a woman makes her own decision about her own mental health in having a baby, and or carrying a baby, carrying a fetus. Now she can do it in consultation with her rabbi, in modern times with her therapist. But who doesn't decide? The government doesn't decide. The court doesn't decide. A woman decides whether, now, again, the idea is, I would not go as far to Judaism, that Judaism would ever suggest that abortion should be birth control. We talk about this kind of cavalierly, but when we were in, some of us went to visit Cuba, and we heard, that it's very hard to get birth control pills in Cuba. And so abortion is actually used as a form of birth control in Cuba. It's interesting that more women would have access to an abortion than they would to contraceptives, but that's Cuba. So Judaism would never go as far as to say that it should be just used cavalierly as birth control. But Judaism would say that if a woman has a compelling reason, certainly physical, but also emotional, to not want to have a baby, then it is permitted to have an abortion. And we have a few more sources. So Jacob Endon is an Ashkenazi source, but here we have about at the same time a Sephardi source. Now that's kind of how it works in Judaism, right? You could have one rabbi that says permitted and another rabbi that says forbidden. It can be a little chaotic at times in the way Judaism is interpreted. I mean, we'd like to think that the big differences today is if you're, conservative, Orthodox, and Reform, but there's also always been a certain amount of chaos in determining Jewish law because different rabbis might decide differently. But here it's interesting that you see an Ashkenazi source, and now we'll see a Sephardi source from about the same time. I asked and searched it's unclear if it's heart or intellect because he searched his lev, and we tend to translate lev as heart, but the rabbi saw the heart as the seat of the intellect. So when somebody says they search their lev, their heart, it also means that they intellectually studied the issue. To examine and explore what I had heard about a small group of women who became pregnant and who do not want to give birth again, and who do not want to remain pregnant anymore once they have conceived. And some of these women, if they become pregnant while nursing another child, and they expect that there'll be an evil eye or danger of the new birth to the living child, and they make a medication and drugs that are known to them to terminate a child, and the child will become a non-viable fetus. Here, there is a suspicion about the pregnancy and its potential harm is acknowledged, and women are therefore permitted to ingest this medication. Behold, we have before us exactly what everyone acknowledges. To illustrate the danger to the living child, and the mother is permitted to drink an abortive drug, and so it seems according to my understanding. So if the mother is worried, I'm going to have too many children and I can't take care of them all, or there won't be enough food, or I'm nursing a child and now I'm pregnant and my milk supply is going to dry up and I'm not going to be able, now I'm going to have too many children to be able to take care of, and it will harm the health and safety of the other children, then she can take a medication and abort the fetus. This is really clear, right? This is really, as I said, it maybe didn't seem so clear when we first started looking at the sources, but it's very clear that in Judaism, that it's ruled that this is permitted. So let's just stop there for a minute. Any questions, comments? Danny Frankel.
All right, well, we've seen a couple of rabbis who have clearly stated that abortions in many circumstances would be permitted, but are there any authorities who have said strictly no?
No.
All
No,
right.
no. Now, if today, there's a lot of sources on this, even in the conservative movement. We're not going to look at really any of them, but there is a variety of opinion within the conservative movement, not about abortion. It's totally permitted. for mental health, for physical health, for whatever reason. There are debates about, the same kind of thing about viability. Today, because a baby can live out of the womb, at a younger, at a younger stage, can you have abortion on demand up until 40 weeks? So there are some in the conservative movement that say yes, if they're, yes, because frankly speaking, most people, if they're having abortions between, 35 weeks and 40 weeks, this is because something terrible has really happened. This is not, something terrible has happened for a woman to have an abortion that late in her pregnancy. But there are questions about how, should there be a time limit? Should there be, if it's the women's health is at risk, you may always get an abortion up until the last possible second. So there are debates about that. I would say, to quote Bill Clinton, if you would look at the conservative movement and ask what's the ideal, safe, legal, and rare, right? Safe, legal, and rare would probably, that's not a legal category, right? That's not a legal category to say, that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, but it's a way of saying we trust the woman, but one should be, cautious in going into this. One shouldn't do it just because, whatever. I mean, you could think of a million different cases, but that, if somebody got pregnant and doesn't want to be pregnant, that as early as possible, the abortion should take place. But even the conservative sources have really stayed away from the idea that you set a time limit, because we do know that you could find out later in pregnancy, or that something could go wrong. And so there's no source in the conservative movement that's going to say up until this time and not past that. Howard, did you have another question? Is your hand
Not a
up?
question. It's just a piece of information which I'm sure people are not aware of. Up until 1972, and you can Google it yourself, the Southern Baptist Convention allowed abortion. So the current evangelical position has evolved over time. I'm not suggesting it's insincere. That's just another piece of information that I'm sure you don't have.
Didn't I read recently that R.V. Wade, that the opinion was written by a Republican? The judge was Republican. Look, this invitation is for all of you. We haven't met yet. I've met with a lot of congregants one-on-one over the last however many months since Yom Kippur. And somebody asked me, I've met with over 100 households, though I don't know where the other 250 households are. So I'm still available. But somebody said to me, have you learned anything? Like what have you learned, like in this? And I would say what I've learned, if you can say that over 100 households are representative of our congregation, is that people are really, really worried about where our country is and how we got here. That is the overarching sense. Whatever I talk about with anybody, even people that have some really sad, terrible things going on in their lives, whatever we talk about, somewhere in the conversation is this real fear about what has happened to our country. How did we get here? What is the future of democracy? How did we get so divided? How did vaccines become political? So abortion became political first. You kind of probably could make a case that the trajectory of all these things didn't really happen overnight. That there's a long, it seems like it happened very quickly to us. Maybe COVID sped up our understanding of what was happening. Trump getting elected sped up what was happening. But the idea of how people looked at things politically, in 1992 and how people look at things politically now, and even with matters of of things that we would consider healthcare. So yeah, so people, so it's not surprising to hear that the Southern Baptists had an opinion at what time that evolved, because, well, first of all, your opinions should evolve. Like in a healthy society, like we would prefer to see them evolve to a more liberal, those of us that are liberal, but things evolve. Judaism evolves. Everything should evolve. But the question about how certain things that we took for granted ended up here, I probably, you could make the case that how abortion evolved is how we got here with vaccines. In any case, Danielle, did you have your hand up? Go ahead.
So these sources all seem to be saying pretty clearly, like, hey, there are so many situations in which this is clearly an okay choice to make. But I'm wondering if there are sources saying something stronger than that, where in fact, there are situations where absolutely you must get the abortion.
The only time I would say that you must get an abortion is if it's your life is at risk. Then you're supposed to save your own life, because the understanding is this fetus is not a viable life and your life takes precedence. Probably would say if you think you're really a mental breakdown, then I don't think it would say must, but should. I think where the areas are really gray, and I don't know that I would feel as clear about what Judaism would say, is giving birth to a special needs child, right? I don't think Judaism would ever say, if you found out that your child, when you were pregnant, Downs, something like that, Judaism would not say you should get an abortion. What Judaism would say is if this was going to be too difficult, right? I mean, look, an adulterous woman, could be a baby that could have been a perfectly healthy baby. If it would allow for that, the idea that it could be just too much, right? Just too much for the mother. But the only time that Judaism would say you must get an abortion would be if your life was at risk. Now, I don't even know if it would go that far, right? Like, I mean, what does must mean? Like if let's say a woman came to my office and asked me this question, and she said, I found out from my doctor that if I carry this baby to term, I will die. Then I would say to her, Judaism would suggest an abortion. If she were to say, well, you know what, anybody watch Stissel? Anybody watch Stissel? Where the woman, one of the characters, risks her life to have a baby, and her husband's not very happy and her family's not very happy, but her life will be meaningless without a baby. Nobody will say, well, you're forbidden. We're calling the police and we're taking you to the hospital, and we're like, it's the choice of the mother, right? So you could say this is what Judaism would say you should do, but at the end of the day, it's left in the hands of the mother. So again, maybe this addresses the whole privacy issue, Jonah, of like your medical care should be between you and your physician and your choice. So I don't know if these sources would support that. I still think we're many years ago, I was asked to give a talk at a senior center about Jewish views on abortion. And there were some people there, some seniors there. It was a interfaith, it was a mixed group. It wasn't for Jewish people. And there were some Catholic people there that let me know that they were shocked and offended. And that, Judaism was basically, proponents of murdering babies. So they said it slightly nicer than that, but not that much nicer, So I feel like when you are dealing with people that believe that this is murder, they have to fight this tooth and nail. That's their job, right? If a law was passed that you could murder babies until they were 3 months old, we would be fighting up in arms that it was murder and this must stop. I think we need to give them the respect that is a valid, I actually don't love talking about they hate women. It's because they hate women. Some of them may hate women, but I feel like let's give them the respect to their religious traditions that if you actually think this is murder, it is incumbent on you to fight this tooth and nail in the courts. I get that. But I would also suggest that because we don't think it's murder and because we live in a democracy that protects religious freedom, we should have the freedom to practice our religion as we see fit. So that's, to me, the debate, right? That's the debate. And we live with a constitution that's supposed to ensure that. And I feel like personally, I feel like that's the better route to go. I think we get lost. I don't know that we win any hearts and minds by talking about they hate women. I mean, we may get some Democratic voters that feel good about that. But I still think about these Republican suburban women. All right, let's just look at a couple of other sources. Oh, I'm sorry, Nancy.
So to me, all this goes back to the United States and protecting your civil liberties. So a friend of mine who is a principal at one of the schools said, well, if everybody's so anxious to have religion in school, let's tell them we'll study the Quran. And that will put an end to that.
That's right.
And
that's right.
I guess my biggest thing with this is if you don't approve of an abortion, and they use abortion very loosely, like birth control, which you said, which drives me crazy, then you have the right not to have to do that. But you don't have the right to tell everybody else what they can do with their bodies. And to me, we've totally lost that part of the Constitution and the rights of people in the United States. Because again, that's why we have so many religions in the United States. And that's why people left England to come to the United States to escape religious persecution, which they turned around and did to everybody else again. Okay. So it seems to me, it's a much, much deeper seated issue. And I agree with you. I think you should be respectful, even though I wouldn't want to be, but I think it's a much better way to go. It's very hard, but it has to go both ways.
Right. Well,
and I don't know how we go to a point now to convince people, I respect your opinion, but you can't tell me what to do as long as I'm not infringing on your rights. And my life and my body is my rights.
Right. Look, I feel like there's only really one. I mean, this is what's so frustrating. There's only one real solution, which is getting out the vote for Democratic candidates. Like, I hate to tell you, but there is no other solution. Like this idea, like Illinois is safe because we're a blue state. Not if we lose the Congress and the Senate, then we're not safe. And there will be a federal law and it will be gone. And I think about all of those, mostly young people, but not all young people that were like, well, if I can't have Bernie, I'm not voting for anybody because, and I'm mad at Bernie Sanders. Like for him to talk about now we need a law, he should have been on that campaign trail every day of his life supporting Hillary Clinton and telling his followers to vote for Hillary Clinton. Like that's the only thing that's is going to protect us because the Supreme Court is gone. So, and when people go like, well, maybe it won't be the final opinion, it's like, what, whatever. So it's very frightening, and it's very, I'll be back to writing postcards soon. Debbie or Rob, I don't know which button has their hand up. Wait, you're muted. Okay, Rob, go ahead. Right, you're mute. You have to unmute.
I did. Okay, a little bit off track, but related. Jewish views on birth control. The Orthodox, my understanding, maybe it's wrong, because I didn't know much about this either, is that they don't believe that birth control is right.
No, that's not okay. That's not correct.
Good. Okay.
Orthodox families believe that you should have as big of a family as you can, right? So they don't use birth control if they were trying to have a lot of children. but they can use birth control if they, for whatever reason, don't want to have more children. The mothers, whatever, for whatever reason. So it is permitted. You may use birth control. Now, there are certain birth controls that are actually not, I don't know how graphic you want me to get. You can't use a condom. You can't use anything that would block a man's semen from going where it's supposed to go. But you can use the pill. You can use a diaphragm. Well, yeah, probably a diaphragm is still okay. So birth control is permitted, but many Orthodox women, choose not to use it while they're trying to, have a big family. Okay. Okay, Debbie Botten. Wait, you're muted again. Rob muted you.
Thank you. What I keep getting back to is, you're talking about, this date and, it's murder by this date or that date. It really shouldn't have anything to do with any date. The issue is women having a right to decide what their body's going to do and what they're going to do with it. So I think when there's so much talk about moving that date around, it doesn't matter.
Right. Right. That's the thing. Again, like even choosing whatever date they might choose. And by the way, for those of us that, God forbid, know anybody that gave birth to a 23-week-old baby, the chance of that baby, so God forbid you know anybody that gives birth at 23 weeks. In some rare, unbelievable medical miracle, the baby may be okay, but it's all, all right, let's just look at, I will come back again for anybody else, but I just want to look at one more source before we call it a night on sources, which is, because I just want to look at the time. This is a more modern Orthodox rabbi who talks about abortion being, well, let's just look at it. This is an Orthodox rabbi in 1991. Here it is clear that saving a life is not the only sanction for permitting an abortion. This is evident from the Talmudic passage that permits a nursing mother to use birth control to prevent pregnancy. Since this prohibition is waived to facilitate normal family relations, it would follow that other ethical and humane factors may also be taken into account. It would seem to me that issues such as the dignity of persons, domestic peace, pain, which all carry significant weight in other contexts, should be considered in making these decisions. So this is a modern Orthodox source who talks about, shalom bayit, domestic peace, right? I mean, I've had this, it's not a pleasant thing, where I've had a couple in my office and, one wants to have children and one doesn't, or I've even had a situation where she was pregnant, she wanted to keep the baby and he didn't want her to keep the baby. They already had children. I mean, these are very, very difficult decisions. And I think this is part of, if any of us know people that have had an abortion, this idea that somehow this is a cavalier decision that people make lightly is such a anecdotally untrue. I don't know anybody that's had an abortion that it wasn't, didn't take an emotional toll, that it wasn't a hard decision, even if it was a teenager, or even if it was a teenager. These are not, nobody that we know, or that I know, takes this lightly. This is a very serious decision. And in any case, so I just want to show you, this is the latest from the conservative movement. We do have a statement after the leak. There is a statement that reiterates the conservative movement's stance on abortion. But this was our Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, and they had updated this in December before the leak. And I think what I am going to do, instead of reading the whole thing, is I'm just going to copy it and I'm going to put it in the chat. Well, okay, hold on. I'm going to put it in the chat for Nancy. And Nancy, can you share it with everyone? Because I don't have the ability to do that. And then Nancy will share it with you and you can open it and then you can read it at your own, at your own time, or if somehow you don't get it through the chat, I'm happy to send it to you. But in any case, it is just reiterates that both surgical and medically induced abortions are permitted in Jewish law, even into the last stages, even surgical abortion into the last stages of pregnancy is permitted. And that is true, even, that they don't accept the viability of all of that. Neither viability nor a woman's right to choose is the basis of Jewish law and abortion, although they play a role only indirectly. What matters in Jewish law is the woman's life and health, both physical and mental. That's what determines when an abortion is permitted. And it doesn't matter, whether the fetus is considered viable by some, law somewhere. That is not how we determine Jewish law. So Nancy, if you heard me, I don't know if you heard me, if you can share that in the chat, or you can let me share with everyone. Anyways, hopefully that will happen. The Sorotas.
I wanted to say, Jews come from a very patriarchal society where love and marriage wasn't even all that important. And given that, it strikes me as very enlightened and gratifying that abortion, more or less at the discretion of the mother, is allowed by Jewish law. I find that really surprising and quite enlightening.
It's really interesting because I did not think about making that point, Barb, and I think it's actually an extremely important point when we're looking at sources from the 1700s, that nobody mentions the father or the husband. You might have thought, and I didn't even think about that, right? You might have thought that it would be like she can have an abortion with the permission of her husband. And it doesn't say that, right? It doesn't say that at all, which is a really fascinating and important point.
I have another point.
Yes.
Okay, so it's about the debate about whether it's a life or whether it's not a life. Of course, religions are going to conflict on that, but the main point here is that you don't owe anyone else any of your organs or vital organs unless you consent. So even if you're no longer living, unless you consented to be an organ donor, they can't harvest your organs. So basically, a woman, if this Roe v. Wade is repealed, a woman will have fewer rights than a corpse.
Oh my God. Thank you, Sheila. That's quite.
I know that's very very dark, but
no, but it's Seth.
Yeah, I thought the non-patriarchal part of it was just, sometimes it seems like Jewish law is ridiculous, and sometimes it's very pragmatic. And this seemed to be one of the very pragmatic cases. It's the same thing with, like, the child is Jewish if the mother is Jewish, because that's the one that can be unambiguously determined who the mother is. So I always thought this, life begins at birth was same sort of thing. It's very pragmatic, it's very unambiguous. And similarly, essentially what this is saying is the mother is the person who's primarily involved and that she should primarily make that decision. So I thought this was one of these cases where it's not patriarchal, otherwise it's just pragmatic. Yeah.
Given that we started with a piece of Torah that talked about if somebody caused a wife to have a miscarriage, he owed a fine to the husband. It could have gone in a different direction. And the fact that, and I actually, I hate to say this, but I love the fact that they're talking about an adulterous woman. Like you'd think an adulterous woman comes to a rabbi, he'd have a lot more to say than whether she should get an abortion or not. Like adultery is a heinous crime in the Torah and in Jewish tradition. And yet in the spirit of pragmatism, and you talk about shalom bayit, like for a woman to give birth to a baby that's and raise a child that's not the child, there's lots of novels written about this, that's not the child of her husband, and whether he knows or he doesn't know or he suspects, and you have to live with this for your whole life. If she doesn't want to do this, like we're going to let her abort the child. Like it is in a way, like, I know Judaism does, it's a patriarchy, but there are so many ways that Judaism was so forward thinking. I mean, there are many ways that it was not, but there were many ways that Judaism was really much more forward thinking on women and women's rights than other traditions, at the same time. Not in everything. Okay. So Nancy said I should be able to share this with you, and I did, and it didn't show up in the chat, so I don't know why. Because I put it into everyone and I hit share, and I don't. Does anybody see a little one in the chat box?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
All
there.
right. So it just didn't show up on mine probably because I'm the one that shared it. So if you open the chat and you hit the link, you can open it in another window, and if you want to read it later, or you want to copy it later, you can see this statement on the Conservative Movements Committee on Jewish Law and Standards.
It's cut off because it's too long, I think.
Okay.
Cuts off right at the beginning of the that said second paragraph.
All right. Let me try to, I'll break it into pieces. Howard. Schickler, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I gave up. For Nancy Schmidt, is Neil Edelman here?
He's not on the call.
Good, so
Okay.
I can lie about what he said.
Okay.
We at our current events group on Thursdays, we have a surfeit of lawyers. And one of the issues that we've been discussing is whether or not the way Roe versus Wade was argued and the cases behind it were a Rube Goldberg structure that was kind of logically weak, and whether or not the better way to have gone would have been on the religious freedom line, because you can only obfuscate and say this is something other than a religious dispute. And I mean, you can just see how all the forces are lined up, and they're explicitly religious. And recent scholarship has had a number of articles saying, that's the way we should go going forward. I'm pessimistic about the effectiveness of that, given that the court will come out where it wants to be. But that's one of the weaknesses in Roe versus Wade, is it's kind of a jerry-built series of decisions that are easily disputed, built on words that are not in the Constitution.
Well, that's why I feel so frustrated with the Democrats, because we've known this since 1973. This has been the slowest train coming. And while we had ample opportunity to remedy it in other ways over these past so many, many years, we didn't. And so here we are, with the sort of the perfect storm. But my God, it's only been lawyers have been telling us that our whole lives, and we knew that the Republicans were coming after this since our whole lives. So
I think the answer is we're in Buffalo and we never expected to be there, and didn't respond to it because we didn't think it was real. But here we are now.
Well, that was really short-sighted. That's a nice way of saying it. All right. Anybody else want to ask anything or share anything? So is anybody surprised by any of this? No, Flo, no. Marsha, a little bit. Max. Yeah, no, as I said, I took for granted that people knew this. but I don't know. People tend to maybe think that, as I said, because for so many years we talked about the Judeo-Christian tradition, that there are so many things that we are so different in our worldview that it's really not accurate. Like the Judeo-Christian tradition is, we all think you should feed the hungry, care for the poor. There are certain, the ways that one should be in the world. But the way we look at the world, ritual law, the way we think about a lot of things is quite different. Seth, did you put your hand up again? Go ahead. You got on mute.
I think where you're seeing is the pragmatism. And I sent a note to you privately that I usually, for those of you, my mother was essentially a rabbi for any practical purpose. She didn't get smicha because they didn't give it to women her age. But anyway, she used to be my go-to for all this sort of stuff. And I would talk to her a lot about it. And I thought it was the pragmatism that came through. The Catholic point of view is intellectually defensible. The life begins at conception. Okay, cool. Perfectly good thing to discuss in a Jesuit seminary. But it doesn't make any, but it didn't seem to, it does a very bad job of addressing issues of real people. And so the thing that surprised me was not what you told me, the Mishnah stuff I knew. This rabbi's opinion from 1750 something, whatever it was, I thought was interesting in two regards. One of them, that clearly at the time, although men didn't talk about it, women knew how to.
Right.
Women have always known how to do birth controls. They've always known how to do abortions. They didn't talk about it, and men said, this is your thing, you do it. But that she talked to Rabbi about it. Rabbi clearly was very pragmatic, that this, would cause problems. It would be a terrible thing to happen, and it shouldn't be done. And I sense that this is where the distinction came, that the Catholics, I think there's two strands here. The Catholics approach this in a very Jesuitical sort of way, as they often prone to, and they come up with utterly ridiculous things, but they're intellectually defensible. They just don't make any sense. And then that got adopted as the right-wing groups were using. I think but I was impressed by the common sense of those rabbinical things, and actually, frankly, the conservative movement thing struck me as also very
I broke it up in
sensible.
pieces so you could see it.
Yeah.
Look, the thing is that the rabbis, even the ancient rabbis, were married.
Yeah.
They had wives. They lived their life to a certain extent within the family, whereas Catholicism, which was the only form of Christianity in those ancient times, men did not live amongst women. And so the considerations perhaps of how these, but the other thing, I actually shared this, there's a funny thing that happens every year at Hanukkah. I just shared this story at the synagogue this week or the week before. Every year at Hanukkah, there's always this thing that goes around, but if Jews put up Christmas trees, what would it have looked like? How would the Talmud have discussed it? And so there's, how big of a tree and how many branches and what defines the difference between a bush and a tree. And if the requirement is a tree and not a bush, then it would have to be, because that's how Jewish law, like if you study Talmud, that's how they want to know, right? Everything needs to be defined and then you need to know. And so a lot of it is not left up to these sort of philosophical musings. It is practical in that way, because if somebody, needs to know what a kosher chicken is, then there are some questions that need to be asked and they need to be answered. And so the same happens with interpersonal relationships, with and really deciding, like, if in real life questions of real people who have real life situations. But I'm glad that it was Barb that pointed out that Jewish law could have gone in a different direction and said a woman can have an abortion, with a signed note from her husband. And the fact that it could have, and the fact that it didn't is, which I really haven't thought about until tonight, is actually also just a really, kind of fascinating aside to all of this.
I don't know if you'd think she got it right, but if you'd agree with my mother, but I remember talking to her about this. Remember, was it Jimmy Carter or someone said, quoted that the Southern Baptists say, if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, then you've committed adultery. And I said, well, that's pretty ridiculous. I don't know any guys that don't look at women with the lust in their hearts. And my mother said, yeah, of course. She said, a Jewish law is not saying you shouldn't do that. You will. Men do that. She said, the important thing is that Jewish law says, don't do anything about it.
Right. Well, I don't know. This is kind of an offense. I feel like I'm going to answer you and then offend. I don't want to offend anybody, but in Yiddish, there is a not the nicest phrase, a goysha cup, right? And somebody who isn't Jewish, so they, think about things in a not correct way. Let's just say that. So when Jimmy Carter said, "I lust in my heart," I had a professor that said, "There's a phrase for that, goysha cup." Like, that's not a Jewish way of thinking of it, right? This is a non-Jewish way of thinking of it. In other words, who cares what you think about in your heart? Nobody holds you responsible. Nobody cares. Frankly, nobody really wants to know, Jimmy Carter, what you think about women in your heart. Just as Seth said, you can't act on it. That's all. You can't act on it. And in a way, what Seth was saying about this pragmatic thing, how do you measure what anybody thinks in their heart, what anybody lusts in their heart? How would you know? How could you measure? How could you possibly mete out a punishment? Because how would you know? But acting on something, that's how you know. And when somebody acts, then you can determine what the right behavior is and what the punishment is for that action. So Judaism, and there are a couple of things in the Torah. It says don't covet, but love your neighbor. But Judaism is really concerned with deeds. Now, bad thoughts can lead to bad deeds, right? It's not like you should ignore, you shouldn't try to get a handle on what you're thinking and before you act. But Judaism basically could care less what Jimmy Carter thinks in his heart. So, all right, anybody else? All right, so, I hope this was informative. I'll be writing my postcards for the midterm elections. I don't know what else to do. People are already talking about it. I don't know what else to do then. I'm not supposed to endorse any candidates or any political parties, but I guess what I would endorse is I just don't know what else we can do but be involved in the political process in our country, and to really work as hard as we possibly can to get the results. And while I will say, all right, this is a political, Nancy, stop recording. I have many things that I could be not so thrilled about Biden. I have many criticisms of things that he's done. There's probably not a week that goes by that I'm not still grateful that he's the president. And he's only the president because people went out and voted for him. So I don't think we should, totally give up hope that there is still a political process, and we can elect our, hopefully elect our candidates that we'd like to see. Rosette?
There's one big problem, and that's the voter suppression that's going on in so many states. I am worried that all those postcards you write, those poor people are going to find it so difficult to get to a poll,
Yes.
to hand in a ballot, that it's going to be impossible. I'm afraid we've already come over, just like with the Supreme Court. I hate to be a bearer of terrible news, but I'm worried. And
Well,
I
you
can
should
see
be
that-
worried, and then we can worry about the Secretary of States and all of those states,
Yeah.
who the election, how will rest in their hands, not in the hands of the voters.
And
But there's plenty to worry about.
get their ballots, counted. I don't know how they're going to do it.
Yes, there's plenty to worry about. There is.
I'm a postcard writer too.
Yeah.
And as I threw the last bunch in the mail to Arizona, I think, I was worried about whether or not I was putting markers on people's doors that they were Democrats.
That's interesting. Okay, the other thing I will say, yes, the other thing I will say is, if we're in a safer place, people can also go back to door and other ways of, getting out the vote that we couldn't do because it wasn't safe. So I don't know. Listen, maybe this is all howling into the wind. I don't know, but Odlo Avda Tikvatenu, right? Judaism. Well, who said this? This wasn't somebody that was Jewish that said hopelessness is not a strategy. I can't remember who said that. I just read that. It was somebody, not a Jewish person. Hopelessness is not a strategy.
It's hope is not a strategy.
Oh, I'm sorry, what is it?
Hope is not a strategy.
Okay, so then maybe it was Ruth Messenger from American Jewish World Service who did a play on that and said hopelessness is not a strategy. So I just read that and I feel like that's what I'm gonna, what else do we have to hang on to, right? Jews never give up on hope. And we have good reason to give up after, 2000 years of, of how bad it was in most of that history. So I don't know what else to do other than, keep doing what we're, keep trying to do what we're doing. So anyways, I will tell you something. I thought this is not hopeful in the big picture. It's only hopeful in the little picture, but I'm a supporter of Midwest Access, which provides money and volunteer help for women that are coming from states, all the states around us where it's so hard to get an abortion, who come to Illinois. This organization, they pick people up at the bus station. They had volunteers before COVID that were putting people up in their homes and helping women, who didn't have the money to get abortions in Illinois. And they are still taking monetary donations, but they are full up for volunteers. They've been overwhelmed by volunteers, so they don't need any more they still need money, but they don't need any more volunteers. And I found something very hopeful about that. Right. I found that was a very hopeful thing that in all kinds of ways, people are helping to try to get women the help that they need. Because it's already, without any of these laws without any changes, it is very hard to get an abortion in Iowa and Indiana, and Kentucky, all the state, right? All of, states that are near us or around us. It's already very hard. So. All right, everyone have a lovely evening and I will see you all soon.